go over chapter 23 really quickly, and then I'll take questions regarding specific questions for the test. So if you look at chapter 23, what it really covers is it covers some discussions we've danced around, at least in kind of the discussion. It really gives kind of a formal explanation of some of these topics we talk about. So kind of like, should policymakers try to stabilize the economy, right? Should we be using fiscal and monetary policy to stabilize the economy, to move it back, or should we wait? What part of fiscal policy should we use? Should we use government spending or tax cuts? How do we do monetary policy? Either through rule or discretion. How much inflation should we have in a country? This one's a little bit there, but should the government balance its budget? We'll talk about pros and cons, which we've already talked about government intervention anyways. And should tax laws be reformed to encourage savings? So a lot of this as I said, we've moved around the topics. It's never really been formally covered. So what this chapter does is it formally covers a lot of issues that you see talked about in the news. I like to do it a little bit depending on how much time I have. We won't spend a whole lot of time on it because it's more kind of a discussion in class, but it's a lot for students who want to be engaged in political debates to read through and understand. Kind of it talks about it from both sides. So let's just look at the first one about stabilization. One reason for stabilization is economies tend to fluctuate. We talked a little bit about pessimism and animal spirits. Is that economies won't move on their own back to equilibrium? And it's possible for politicians to do that. And how they do that is what they call leaning against the wind. So if things are going kind of on a bad direction or going negative, policymakers should be trying to increase aggregate demand. If things are going really good, then policymakers should be trying to decrease aggregate demand. And they have the tools to do that to keep us at a nice equilibrium, what they call a stable economy. They like to do part one. They like to increase aggregate demand. They don't like to decrease aggregate demand. Part two is not well received. Part one is when things are going bad, they like for the economy to be sped up a little bit, but when the economy is going fast, they don't like to be slowed down. So there is ways for governments to be actively in the market. But as economists and as citizens, we should know what are some of the drawbacks. Why don't they? We talked about before lags. They have to be well in advance to make it work. Because the economy is unpredictable, it's hard to figure out what's going to happen in the next 3 months, 6 months. And if we're too late, it could make things worse. And the economy does pretty well on its own. Why do we need to be involved? At least on minor problems. So there's a lot of discussion on maybe we don't need to be involved as much as we can, as they may not be able to make the proper decisions to stabilize. Government spending adds directly to aggregate demand. We talked about this. They talk about the percentage of tax cut only partially goes. States are required to keep balanced budgets. So by the federal government can help states prevent laying off workers or savings jobs. There's kind of a benefit from a federal standpoint because the federal government doesn't require a balanced budget. So during recessions, when taxes decrease because we have less income, states may have to lay off workers because they don't have as much income coming in, and they still have to spend the same amount of money. The counter argument to that is we know the economy fluctuates. States should save up for times of recession so they don't have to lay people off. Again, these are difficult political decisions. Just like it's not easy for you to save money, it's even harder for politicians to save money. But in reality, they should, because they know there's going to be fluctuations. But because they don't, we should use government spending. So there's a lot of discussion there. I really can't give it justice in the time I have. But if you're interested in these arguments, read more about them in the book. Why should we do it with tax cuts? It increases consumption spending. People will spend it on things they think is best for them. It can also increase investment, as individuals might go out and invest in their businesses, which might increase aggregate supply by creating more jobs and opportunities. And as we talked about it may not be wasteful. If I give you money, you're going to spend the money in the most efficient manner possible. Remember, government officials, if it's not their money, may spend it on what they call bridges to nowhere. And they do. That's a lot of government spending. I said, it doesn't matter. I said, I don't pick on any political party. They all do it. I said, a lot of time government spending goes to its friends and people that may not provide the proper service, the most efficient services. The term we use is called bridges to nowhere. You can look that up. It's a reference to an Alaskan bridge that the government was going to spend millions of dollars on to connect two towns in remote Alaska. So that's where it comes from. How do we do monetary policy? So right now, the Federal Reserve has complete discretion how they do monetary policy. In fact, their two goals are low unemployment and low inflation. If you think about what monetary policy does, is it only influences aggregate demand. You should see that these two goals can't move in the same direction. Monetary policy of the Federal Reserve can't set monetary policy to get low unemployment and low inflation. So they have to kind of choose what to do. So that's where the discretion comes in. How do I decide which one to go after? So because there's this discretion and we're fueled by our biases, some economists argue monetary policy should be made by a rule. In a lot of other countries, it is. And there's two ways to make rules. One is make a constant money growth rate. Most of the time they argue money should grow by 2% a year. The end. Just increase the money supply by 2% a year. You're arguing why 2%? Well, if you remember the equation, m times v equals p times y. If y is growing by 2% and I increase m by 2%, velocity is constant. That will keep prices constant. That will keep low inflation. And you're transparent about how you're going to increase your money supply. Another way to do it in a similar vein is what a lot of other countries do. They call it inflation targeting. Is that a country has to keep their inflation between 0 and 2%. And that if it moves beyond this range, we have to increase or decrease money supply accordingly. So if it goes above 2%, they're going to decrease the money supply. Sorry, and if it goes below 0%, they're going to increase the money supply. So what it gives is stable policy and stable prices. So they focus a lot on this low inflation. Because remember, that's what the Federal Reserve can do most efficiently. is they can address inflation. Why they shouldn't allow discretion, right? It involves competent central bankers. We do a pretty good job and have done a pretty good job with competent central bankers. But what happens if they mess up? They can do a lot of harm in their people, so their potential for abuse. They have the ability to fluctuate the economy based on what they call political business cycles to try to change elections, and we really don't like that. In the United States, we're somewhat independent, but we see this a lot more in other countries, is that they try to influence the economy based on what they call the political business cycle. Is that there's some discussion there. It's hard, even if they promise political stability, is that they may not be able to or may not hold true on that during a recession. Because remember, unemployment goes up and prices go down, but they may not go down far enough for the central bankers to act if they're under a roll. Why we allow discretion? Same reason we always do. Is it allows flexibility. Now, rule's a rule. If I allow discretion, there is some flexibility to react to unforeseen events. They argued political business cycles and timing consistency aren't that big a deal, and it's difficult to specify what rules would work best. So it's any time you talk about rules and discretion. Same thing would apply for monetary policy. Should we have zero inflation? Government prints too much money, society faces a trade-off. How much inflation should the central bank accept? Is zero the right target? The ones who argue for zero, no costed inflation. Having zero inflation only involves temporary cost, because remember, high unemployment doesn't persist. So to get to zero inflation and keep it there only involves temporary cost, not long-term cost. Why we wouldn't be zero? Because even sacrificing there, because remember the sacrifice ratio is about 5%. So to sacrifice 5% of a year's GDP for 1% reduction in inflation, say they go from 1% to 0%, the cost of inflation aren't high enough probably to justify moving that way, right? So the benefits from the reduction of inflation cost isn't worth the cost of GDP to say move from 1% to 0%. There's also some psychological benefits. We don't talk a lot about it. But I like to see my paycheck go up, right? Even if my paycheck went up 2% and inflation went up 2%, remember my real change is zero. But I like world A better than world B, where my paycheck doesn't change and inflation doesn't change. We're the same off in world A and world B. However, we find individuals are happier in world A. So there is sometimes a little bit of benefit from a little bit of inflation. Right? So almost the universal number is about 2%. Anything above 2 is usually seen as a problem. Why should we balance the budget? If we don't balance the budget, somebody still has to pay off the debt. So if we don't balance our budget today, all we're doing is burdening future generations, which may not seem fair. I spent the money today and going to make my grandchildren pay it off tomorrow. That's probably not a very fair thing to do. I got the benefit and my grandchildren are going to have to pay for it. So that doesn't necessarily align costs and benefits. We talked about crowding out, and we talked about with less investment, there's less growth and future living standards. So if you think about this, the way for balanced budgets is not only do I get all the benefit, I then make growth slower, so future generations are worse off again. There may be some discussion that they might be justified during recessions or wars. However, we seem to have a problem with peacetime debt. And it's starting to become unsustainable and detrimental. Arguments against, it's right now only a tiny percentage, so you might not need to worry about it. Cutting education or raising taxes have detrimental effects. I said, but I think most people would find other ways to do it, but that's what they talk about. Divert attention from other programs that redistribute. Debt to income is more relevant than debt itself, and that is true. That's the number we should really care about rather than how much debt we have. And the last one, I'm not going to go through. It talks about tax reforms to encourage savings. So one of the big discussion is, do we change our taxes from a consumption tax to a sales tax? And it goes through who would benefit and who wouldn't. All right, so that's kind of the quick discussion. I didn't want to go a whole lot into it because not a lot of it's going to be on the test. So I didn't want to cover a lot of it. I just wanted to kind of give you that there is some discussion about it. I wish we had more time to cover it. We don't. I'm sorry about that. We just kind of ran out of time. But for those who are really interested, that chapter is a very interesting chapter. I mean, we just don't have a lot of time to cover it in class. So what I'm going to spend the rest of the time doing is going over any questions you have about the test that will be on Wednesday. I guess you can sign up to take the test today if you so desire, but you must take it by Wednesday night. So please sign up for the test if you haven't already. And are there any questions? No, Wednesday, there will be no class on Wednesday. Friday will be final exam review. Since Wednesday is actually the test day, I will not have anything on Wednesday. Again, I give you multiple days to take the test, but on my kind of syllabus, Wednesday is the test day. But yes, on Friday, there will be final exam review, correct, but not on Wednesday. If you work the homework and quiz, you have seen this graph. No, Shelby, there will not be a practice test for the final. The final is really cumulative. Nope, Taylor, it'll be the same as always. The final review will be, you need to bring me questions. When you're looking over it, you should have lots of questions. I find that's really the fair way to do it. I don't want to cover material you don't understand. The final by rule is the 5th and the 6th, I believe, or the 4th and the 5th. Whatever day the university so dictated, next Tuesday and Wednesday. 4th and the 5th. Correct. That is on Examity. Yes, Wyatt, I said I can't remember. The university dictated those dates, so that's why I'm not as good with them. Is I didn't get a choice in what day the final were. It has to be the 4th and the 5th on Examity. There is no wiggle room there. Please schedule early. Like, you should already have a final exam scheduled date and time. If you wait till May 4th, you will be in trouble. There will be 80 questions on the final, Galid. It'll be twice as many as the unit exams. You'll have an hour and 50 minutes. So twice as long. All right, so please make sure you understand this graph. It's probably one of my favorite graphs to use. I just put a lot of points up there because I can use this graph and I can ask lots and lots of questions. So what I like to do is, say you're starting, oh wow, that's an ugly marker. Starting at point A. And let's say there's a stock market crash. So if I'm starting at point A and there's a stock market crash, so what we should ask is, well, what happens in the short run? So if we look at this, if we start at point A in the short run, remember the stock market crash causes aggregate demand to decrease. And when aggregate demand decreases, in the short run, we're going to end up at point B. And at point B, we have lower GDP, lower prices, higher unemployment. So we are in a recession. All right. So now that we're in a recession, what are our options? So we have two options. We have government intervention or nothing, or no government intervention. All right, so if we have government intervention, what are the options for the government to intervene? Well, since we're at point B, what the government wants to do is it wants to get us back to point A. So the government's going to want to increase aggregate demand. Well, how do they increase aggregate demand? You can do it through fiscal policy, which is decrease taxes or increase government spending. Or you can do it through monetary policy. And if we go through monetary policy, we go back to our graph, and what we find is we increase money supply. Right? And how do we increase money supply? Right? Lower the reserve requirement, lower the discount rate, or buy bonds. So those are all possibilities of what we would do to fix the economy if we believe in government intervention. And government intervention will get us back to point A. What if we pick option 2? What if we do no government intervention? Then the economy adjusts as short-run aggregate supply shifts right. And we end up at point C. So what's the difference between A and C? The only difference is a higher price level, or you'll see more inflation in A than in C. The GDP is the same at both options. So I like to ask these questions because I can say, well, what if I start at point D? Okay, I was at C and now I'm at point D. There's too much inflation. What do we do? Right, so we were at point C, I moved to point D. There was a stock market boom. What happens in the short run? What happens in the long run? All of those are options available to me. And ask, how does the government intervene? Okay, what happens if we have too much inflation? What does the government do? And it allows me to use lots of different opportunities. So you should be familiar with this graph and be able to tell me what happens where. So you should remember, what are the aggregate demand shifters? What causes aggregate demand to shift, right? Anything that involves C, I, G, and NX. So this is the graph that seems to give students the most problems. So please make sure you understand how things move in this graph. Any other questions? No, so if there's a change in the price level, all that does is move us along the curve, Francisco. Right, so if we change the price, it's what it always is, right? So a change in price level we move along aggregate demand. Right, and that is the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. That's a good question. No, that's a very good question. Is we just move along it, correct? I assume that was kind of what you were getting at, but that's okay. That's a good question. And remember, when we talk about changes in price level, you should be able to explain to me the wealth effect, the exchange rate effect, and the interest rate effect, what that causes to happen and how that causes a shift in output. All right, so remember, the wealth effect deals with consumption, investment, net exports. So please make sure you go back through and look those over if you can't remember what they are. And look at examples of them that I've asked in the quizzes. A velocity of money is how fast money changes hands. If I ask you to calculate it, you're going to use this formula. M times V equals P times Y. Quantity theory of money. And I'll give you either the price in real GDP, or sometimes I'll just call it nominal GDP, because that's what nominal GDP is. And I'll give you the money supply. So most of the time, if we're going to calculate velocity, that is how we will calculate velocity. Anaya, you won't know your final grade until the final is done. I won't take them out of Blackboard. I do it on my own Excel sheet because I do it to make sure that everyone sees the grades they got. I don't want to say, well, he did. You see all the grades and you will always have access to those grades. And I pull them out on the back side so you can see what grades, you could actually figure out which grades I pulled. Whichever ones are zeros. I will send you kind of an Excel spreadsheet this afternoon when I send the announcement. It's very, very basic, and I'm hoping it works. It's the first time I've ever tried to send it. Is what you'll do is you'll go and you'll count your 15 highest homework grades, your 15 highest quiz grades, add them together, and fill out the sheet to see how much you need on the final to get an A, B, C, or D. I'm hoping it works. So we'll try it to see how well it works here. I said it's for informational purposes only. It will not be set in stone. What's set in stone is the syllabus point totals. So check the syllabus, and it tells you at the end of the semester how many points you have. That is what I will go by. I'm hoping my little Excel sheet will help, but I'm just going to add up points at the end of the semester, and we'll go from there. Kind of a warning on the Excel spreadsheet. It's supposed to tell you how many questions you need right on the final to get an A, B, C, or D. Don't look at that and say, oh, all I need is 40 questions right to get a C for the class, and you get 35 questions right on the final because you didn't study and didn't put any effort in, and you get less than half the questions right on the final. Do not expect to get a C if you didn't get the total points you needed. So don't go, well, I only need 40 points. I don't have to study. Please make sure you still study. Years ago, I had a student that happened to. She only needed like 50 questions right to get an A for the class. She got 35 questions right. Needless to say, she didn't get her A and was extremely disappointed. But please make sure you study all the way up to the end. This isn't just I can cash it in and I'm going to get the grade I want. Please make sure you earn your grade. I don't give the grade away. You see the point totals. I add it up, and I just record your grades. I don't give any grades one way or the other. Okay. I said there are plenty of students I feel extremely bad for, but I just add the points up because I try to be as fair as possible. That sometimes gets me seen as a little cold, but I'm trying to be as fair as I try to treat everyone exactly the same. I know that's difficult. Other questions? Francisco, that hopefully I did answer your question about velocity. Yes, no, maybe so. Okay. It's hard to know. I can't see anybody's face, so I can't determine if that answers your question or not. I just try to talk and I guess. All right, Gilly, what do you mean by the PC curves? Oh, Phillips curve. The Phillips curves. Got it. Okay. Sorry, you usually just called the Phillips curves, but yes, okay, I got them then. All right. So the Phillips curves. Okay. Right. So we have inflation and unemployment, correct? So you have inflation and unemployment. So most of the time when we talk about the Phillips curve, we talk about there's a short run relationship and a long run Phillips curve. So in the short run, we see the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the long run, there is no relationship. Because remember, this will be what we assume to be the natural rate of unemployment. So in the long run, there is no relationship between how much inflation we have and unemployment, as we will settle at the natural rate, which is based on frictional and structural forces in the economy. And inflation would be determined by monetary policy in the long run. However, the short run Phillips curve, that's where we can get these changes in aggregate demand that can influence it. Any other kind of specifics there? I'm not exactly sure what you want there. Was there a specific question about shifts in the PC curves that you want to talk about, Naya? I assume it's out of the homework, if I'm correct. Okay. Let me pull up the homework really quickly here. You won't see shifts on the test. I don't like the shifts part, but the homework does a lot more than I like them. Sorry about that. I can't make the homework as it comes from the book, and I can't create my own interactive homework yet. So let me see here which ones. Sorry, I'm just trying to see which questions you. All right, sorry, I'm just trying to find the right question on here. I'm looking at them. All right. Okay. So kind of the rules behind this. So I'm hoping this is the question. Let me share it with you. Let me open this up. Sorry. Here, I'll open it up. It's not a big deal. I can do this. Let me pull it up. Here we go. All right. Most of the time, I'm not going to ask it, but I will go over the homework here. I assume this is the question you struggle with. The following graphs show the state of the economy that is in the long run with the Phillips curve like this. I'm hoping this is the question. All right. All right. So it's kind of a funky little question because they also don't have short run in here, but that's okay. We can work without it. So what we would do here, is this one the graph one? All right. So what it asks is what happens when the economy decreases the money supply? So if we decrease the money supply, I said the problem is my pen doesn't work here, sorry. So what will happen here is aggregate demand will decrease or shift left. And when that happens, short run Phillips curve will shift left as well. And that happens when we decrease the money supply. So the answers would be the long run effect is a decrease because anytime we decrease the money supply, the long run effect will always be a decrease in the money supply. Doesn't change the unemployment rate, doesn't change real GDP. Which of the following is true? Oh, my curve didn't move, sorry. But as I said, the curve should have went left. Short run Phillips curve went left. All we know is what the natural rate of unemployment is because we have it here. We find the long run effects change there. So I wouldn't worry about it. I'm not shifting the Phillips curves on the test, and I don't believe I do. It's, as I said, it's not my way of liking that. I just really like the question. It's impossible really to edit them. I like it for the last statement is why I picked it. Is I want that last statement of what happens to short run and long run inflation and unemployment is really why that question is there. It does. It does, Francisco. And when we increase the interest rate, correct. So decrease money supply. It does increase the interest rate. So when we decrease the money supply, it increases the interest rate. When we increase the interest rate, causes there to be less investment in the economy, which lowers aggregate demand, which causes less output and less price level. Oops. Sorry, sorry, Danielle. Thank you for letting me know. I said when I keep switching screens, I can't forget to hit share. So here's what should happen, Francisco. When we decrease the money supply, causes an increase in the interest rates. Right? Theory of liquidity preferences. Less investment, lower aggregate demand, less GDP, less price level. Yes, that that does happen, Francisco. You are not the first one that happens to. I don't have an easy way to fix that problem. And I said, I've had that happen a lot. I don't know how to make it easier or harder. Those are just the terms we use, inflation and interest. Other questions? All right, if there are no other questions, then I